All right, so if we're good to go, I will count us down and we will go. My records are rolling in 3, 2, 1. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Jeff Frick here, coming to you for another episode of Work 20XX, and we're excited to have a repeat from almost exactly a year ago joining us for an update, and that's Julie Whelan. She's the Global Head of Occupier Thought Leadership at CBRE, joining us, I think, this time from Boston again, right, Julie? How are you? Great to see you.
Yes, good to see you, Jeff. I can't believe a year has gone by, and I am joining you from Boston, but not from my home, this time from the office.
Well, that's good. Flexibility is all the rage. So it's funny, last time we talked, it was summertime, and it was kind of heading into the first kind of Labor Day return to office. And at that time, I remember you said it was kind of odd because, there was a slow uptick that wasn't kind of traditional seasonal because we were kind of coming out of COVID. It's been a year. You've put out the latest version of the spring 2023 U.S. Office Occupier Sentiment Survey. So we're going to get into it in depth, but what are some of the big deltas from last year that kind of jumped off the page to you?
Well, Jeff, I'd say the biggest thing that we're seeing this year that was different from last year is that organizations are making some decisions. And when I say that, it's around this question about how often do you want your employees to come back to the office? And I know that that is a very hot topic that has a lot of sensitivities around it, I'm sure, for our listeners. But what we're finding, at least in the data, don't hurt the messenger, is that there is absolutely a parting of the seas happening. And what I mean by that is last year at this time, you had nearly 50% of our respondents that were saying, I'm allowing people to be in the office half and half, and I'm not really dictating what days they come in or how often they come in, but that's what I would like, is about half and half. This year, what we see is a marked difference where organizations are either deciding to be in the office camp or they're deciding to be in the remote camp, because I think that they realize that trying to build critical mass in the office when you're allowing kind of a 50-50 mentality can be difficult. And so we see most organizations swaying towards mostly in the office. That still means they're hybrid. That still means they have flexibility. They just expect people to be in the office more than not. And you still have a decent amount, although less, that are saying we're going to be a remote first organization. And again, that doesn't mean they never come together. They just don't come together that often.
It's interesting. One of the great quotes that you had last time we talked was that, hybrid, which is not your favorite word, is going to be different for every organization, every group within the organization, and then even within the individuals within a particular group. And as you said, and it comes out pretty clearly in the research, we're getting this bifurcation now where kind of anybody can figure out what they need to do. Is going away. And they're getting this, kind of direction on high. But you just said it there in that open that even if you're office first, that doesn't mean office all the time. So are you seeing, kind of a move down in terms of establishing of group norms beyond the, kind of executive level from on high? This is the kind of organization we want to be?
Yes. I mean, the communication around what hybrid means for an organization and how people are supposed to operate in an organization has to be far reaching. It does not just end with a memo that's written from executive management and gets driven down the organization. That might be a good starting point in showing what the leadership thinks and feels and directs and dictates in this area. However, ultimately, this is a middle management challenge to actually execute. And what I mean by that is most organizations are telling us that although they might have a tone that's set from the top down, they know that they cannot have a blanket approach to how often every single person and every single function within the company is supposed to come in the office and when they should. So that means that it's at the manager level that are managing those unique teams and unique functions around the organization that have to be armed to be able to make the decisions and help their people decide when is best to come in and create the impetus for them to want to come in. And so what that means is that organizations need to help train and upskill their managers to be able to do that. Another really interesting thing that we see is even from the more junior levels of the organization, if you have a champion who really believes in the office for a certain reason, they can influence it through social media and through almost like a fear of missing out. And I know that might not be a popular belief, but across so much of our life, every time we pick up social media, we're getting influenced to buy something or to go visit a certain place. And really, this is no different. It's just an extension of that into the office environment. And we see that organizations that are leveraging it well, it's working.
Yeah, it's interesting. Phil Kirshner from McKinsey just had an article that came out a week or so ago. It's called "Is Your Workplace Ready for Flexible Work?" And he talked about, very specifically, similar to your research, that the mandates from the direction that we want to go are very, very high and consistent. Unfortunately, what's lacking, kind of on the back end, is the work part of it. Not only the training of those managers, but giving them the tools, and also having kind of defined workplace norms that now people know what to go with once they get the message from those mandates. So, are you seeing anything with those middle managers? Are you seeing anything kind of concrete from your world? You're not really in it, but I'm just curious within the sentiment survey if the middle managers are making their voice heard a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I would say is you said an interesting word there and use the term mandates. And we were very careful not to talk about mandates because we actually don't see many organizations implementing mandates right now. They might be implementing requirements. And the reason that those fall short of mandates is because mandates assume, just by using that word, that there's going to be some kind of a consequence if you're not following the direction that the organization or that the middle level management sets out. And the reality is, although we have a decent amount of organizations, more than half of them, that say that they're tracking employee attendance through one way, shape, or form, most of them are not doing anything about it if that attendance is not achieving the results that they intend. And so that's why I would say we're stopping short of a mandate right now. And that's where managers themselves are really stuck between a rock and a hard place, because on one hand, they can try to use all these tools to nudge behavior in the right direction and lead by examples by coming into the office themselves and saying that certain meetings need to have in-office attendance. But ultimately, if their people aren't following the guidance, there's not much that they can do. And so one of the areas that we're starting to see grow in interest, again, not always in popularity, but is in tying office attendance to performance goals. And that is an area that we do see some organizations using, and we will see, how that turns out over the long run, because this is all very new right now.
Right. Well, yeah, there was a prominent CEO that recently said that attendance is going to be on your performance reviews. And you call out specifically, as you just mentioned, the difference between having a direction versus having tracking, and then versus coming down if people aren't actually responding to the direction. But I'm curious on the tracking thing, right? Because there's lots of elements to tracking. You quote, and a lot of people quote, the Castle data for badge swipes for occupancy. So that's a way of tracking. There's also, we hear from Ryan at Miller Knoll that there's all types of ways to track whether people are sitting at their desk or not. And then, of course, there's the little bit more ominous things in terms of, hours on Zooms or keystrokes or some of those things, which are really detrimental to people's attitudes. When you think about the evolution of office and the fact that more and more of the space is going to be dedicated not to desks, but to collaboration space and team space and socialization space, how are you guys starting to think about and help your clients think about measuring utilization? Because it's not just butts and seats anymore.
Correct. I mean, I grew up in a time where we did have a database where we had seats and not or names assigned to seats. And if you had names assigned to 80% of the seats, then you thought that you were doing well, regardless of if those people were coming in or not. And I can say 12, 15 years ago, we weren't even thinking about utilization and how often those people were actually coming in. And I think you hit the nail on the head that tracking means many different things. You can track because you want to understand who's coming in order to try to drive return to office policies. You can track in order to understand utilization of space, to understand if you have the right type of space and you're planning for it appropriately. And you can also track to see, quote unquote, how productive people are being. And I say productive in quotes because there is a growing school of thought that says, what does productivity mean? Maybe if you're a call center, you can absolutely track number of keystrokes or successive calls or number of calls themselves to understand how productive an employee is being, because there are key performance indicators that are pretty cut and dry. But most of us are knowledge workers, and us being knowledge workers is only growing as the accelerated technology of artificial intelligence takes hold, because we're going to have to go off of the more subjective areas of our job to really make a difference in our organizations and tap into our empathy and cultural aspects more. And so what that means is that we are no longer driven off of productivity, because what does productivity mean there? Instead, we often talk about organizational effectiveness. And Suzette Sparks, who's the leader of our change management division here at CBRE, introduced me to that term. And it's this idea that you have set goals that are aligned with the strategic goals of your organization, and your manager and you should be sitting down on a very often basis to review those goals and see if they're being met and if they are still in line with the overall objectives of the organizations. And regardless of where you are doing those goals and achieving those goals, if they're achieving positive outcomes, then ultimately you should be in a good, effective place for the organization. Now, where we originally started this conversation was utilization, in order to understand, which is a very healthy way to use utilization data, is to understand how spaces are being utilized. And there's multiple levels of utilization data. I'd say most organizations still today are just looking at badge swipes. And that gives you limited ability to know who's coming in and out on any given day and maybe how long are they staying. But true utilization data and more sophisticated data comes into play when you're using things like sensor technologies or threshold technologies that allow organizations to actually understand how the different spaces within their workplace are being used, so that they can, on a more real-time basis, change the function of spaces in a way that meets the way their people are actually using that space. Whereas, again, back when I was growing up in this industry, you put a lot of TI, a lot of capital dollars into a build out, and then you really didn't usually revisit it until 10 years later when it maybe needed a carpet and paint refresh.
You can't do that anymore, can you?
No.
I want to double click on the effectiveness versus productivity, because I like it, because everybody likes to bring up productivity. And as you say, it's hard to measure. And one might argue that, kind of lazy management practices along a lot of things like communicating goals and this and that we're kind of part of the problem, where it's easy to measure whether somebody's just in their seat or not. When she's talking about that and digging into that philosophy, is it as much about, better management in terms of defining the objectives so then you can manage to the effectiveness against those objectives? It seems like that really maybe be a bigger problem than people saying, it's productivity or not productivity based on whether your butt's in the seat.
Correct. And I mean, this is a tall order, right? This isn't easy to do. And this is why, honestly, the confluence of human resources and information technology and real estate are coming together, because in a way, this isn't a real estate challenge, right? This is a human resources challenge to teach how to manage against goals, how to teach to create goals, and how to teach to have the hard conversations if the goals aren't being achieved as set out. One thing that I would say is that although it might have been easier to either manage by vision, right, and walk out of your office and see everybody there and assume that everybody's doing a good job on a day-to-day basis, I think one thing we need to realize is that we had a very unengaged workforce back then. And we still, to an extent, have a highly disengaged workforce. But I believe that recent data is coming out and saying that those that work in a more hybrid way are actually feeling more engaged with their organizations. And so I think that that's important, because just because somebody is in an office does not mean that they are being productive. And in fact, there's a topic that we call presenteeism. And it's this idea that you might be physically present in a actual office building, but you might not actually be mentally present in terms of doing your job effectively. And in that case, you're taking more money from the organization than you're, providing value to that organization in that case.
Yep. And it's funny too, Darren Murph talks a lot about, he's just pure remote, his company, but, his point is well taken that, best practices in communication and meeting best practices and all these things that are good for remote work are good for all work. And that, it's really kind of a digital first attitude versus a location first attitude that ultimately can drive the effectiveness. But we are talking about real estate, and, kind of like football, it has 11 players. The traditional work week has 5 days. So you can't evenly split it down the middle. So there's kind of this 2.5 day thing. And you mentioned both in the companies that have office first directives, as well as those that don't, there's still an expectation that your time in office is less than 5 days, but it's, kind of swinging on one side or the other of that 2.5 days. So what are you seeing in terms of actual, days in the week based on, kind of what the corporate directive is?
Well, there's no denying it. It's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And that's something that, at least right now, it's the least of anybody's worries. Because I think that if organizations are getting people in on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and they're building a critical mass in that day, I would argue to say that they pretty much feel that they are nearing steady state. Many have just discounted Fridays, especially some Mondays, although there does tend to be higher occupancy on Mondays than Fridays, but certainly Fridays, just discounting it and saying we're not even going to, go there. Now we're in early stages, right? This is an evolution. This is a journey. This is going to take a while. And so right now, I think that declaring victory just by saying, okay, we're getting that critical mass midweek, the questions that are going to come next are, well, how do I efficiently manage my office space when I only have people coming in 3 days a week? And I'm paying for a lease that, in essence, I could use 7 days a week if I wanted to. Are there certain operational contingencies, et cetera, that I'm going to start to ask my landlord for because I'm not using that office space as much on Mondays and Fridays? Are there a way to shut down floors on certain days of the week and squeeze those that are coming in to those days of the week or to those floors that to build a critical mass on less floors during days of the week that are less occupied? So there's a lot of different things, I think, that are going to be creatively discovered over the next couple of years as we really grapple with this. Ultimately, there's a lot of questions of, are we moving into a 4-day work week? And in this survey, we did ask that question specifically. We asked about kind of non-traditional work measures, from being able to amend the times of your day to being able to go into the office on a rotating schedule. And then we also talked about this idea of a 4-day work week. And interestingly, more respondents answered that they were looking into this than we even thought. 20% of respondents said we are looking into a 4-day work week, with about 17% saying that they were exploring it, 3% saying that they were implementing it. So very early days for that. But I think some organizations are thinking, if I can get people into the office Monday through Thursday, but then tell them on Fridays that's ultimately their ultimate flex day because I'm not even expecting them to work, they can use that for personal time. You can see how that could be a winning equation for some companies. Not all companies for sure could implement that.
Right. So let's talk about offices and buildings, because that's right in your wheelhouse, and that's kind of the essence of the report. And there's a couple things that come out. One is that there's bifurcation in the market, like there is in everything, and there's certain types of buildings with certain features that are taking the brunt of the negativity, even though they get most of the ink on the headlines. And there's other ones that are not having that. So how, when you see the breakdown of kind of buildings themselves and the amenities, because one of the things we talked about a year ago is an increase in flex, an increase in more hospitality-like services, a podcast studio, or a better collaboration space. Are you starting to see that, and is that starting to impact whether you've got a healthy building or a not healthy building?
Yes. So it is very interesting what's happening in the office market right now. And let's start with the challenge, and then we'll end with the good. So from the buildings that are challenged, they are very certain characteristics, right? I think that the headlines in the media definitely want to grab the story about how challenged the office market is and the death of the office, et cetera. But the reality is we are at 30-year high vacancy. And even at that, we still have more than 80% of our market that's occupied. Now, I'm not going to say that vacancy isn't going to continue to climb, because it will, but largely the majority of our office market is likely going to continue to be occupied over the long term. So the question is, of that vacancy that we have in the market, let's say 20 some odd percent of it, where is that space? And we set out to study this, and we actually created a study that we called Hardest Hit Buildings. And in a nutshell, what we found is that of the vacancy that was added to the market over the last 3 years, 80% of it came from 10% of the buildings. So a very small percent of the stock. And the next logical question is, well, where is this challenge stock? And it was highly placed in the Northeast and in the West, in downtown markets that had high crime, low amenity score areas. And so it is the struggling submarkets and the buildings in those struggling submarkets that are of the older vintage, not the oldest vintage, because we actually found that it's this kind of 1980 to 2009 built space that's actually struggling the most, that are in those troubled submarkets. So then you transition over to the good. And the good is exactly the opposite story. We have great submarkets across even those markets in the Northeast and the West, and certainly in the Sunbelt markets that are doing really well. I'm in one of them. The Seaport District in Boston is one of those. Fulton Market in Chicago, the Penn Ave District in New York. These are all areas that have the confluence of neighborhood amenities and the ecosystem of neighborhoods that organizations want to be in. So trophy buildings, quote unquote, that are in those neighborhoods are certainly have more resilience to them than even trophy, quote unquote, buildings that are in the neighborhoods that are struggling the most. And so what makes up a great neighborhood? Well, certainly being on public transit does not hurt. That is a very good thing, especially as a focus on commutes is so important. Secondly, what's important is mixed use. So in many cases around our cities in the United States, we have office districts. And those office districts were born from a place in history where people moved out of the city because they had transportation networks through cars to get back into the city when they needed to work, and they had a necessity to come to the same place in office buildings to work together. All of that is no longer true, 50, 60 years later. And so what we're in is a place now where if the office isn't a necessity to come into, then you need to make the district that the office is in a necessity by nature of the mixed use things that are in that district.
Right.
So if you look at the Seaport, you have residential and you have people across all generations that are living there. You have office, and you don't only have office, but you have office in one of the most budding industries that there is, which is life sciences. You have tourism, you have leisure, you have entertainment, you have all the factors in that market that is driving a 24/7 community that is keeping crime low and that is keeping foot traffic in that area flowing, so that even the retail in that area can sustain itself, not only off of the 9 to 5 worker traffic, but also off of all the other foot traffic that's visiting that market. But then you look at a CBD area, which might be 1 or 2 miles away, which is really just there to have office, and that is not doing as well. And the story is playing out in submarket to submarket across the US. So once you have your submarket set, if you're a trophy building in that submarket, you're going to be more resilient. Frankly, even if you're a commodity building in that submarket, you're probably going to be even more resilient. And then we turn into what's happening in the building envelope. And that's where amenities are important, absolutely. And there are amenities around convenience, food and beverage, wellness, fitness, sustainability, shared amenities that the landlord is offering their tenants. Those are the things that are making up great buildings right now. But even a great building in a struggling submarket isn't going to be great.
Right. But I just, in those nice markets, it seems like they only need to look outside to see what it is that they need to offer the people, right? Because why do you go to a restaurant? You go to a restaurant for an experience you can't get at home. Right. And why do you go to a hotel for your offsite? Because it's got facilities there that you don't have at home. You don't have a meeting space. You don't have a collaboration space. You don't have a bar to hang out and be social. So, it seems like, Miller Knoll did a great report on those two things. And then the third one was heads down library kind of space, which a lot of people can't get at home for lots of reasons. So it seems like, the answer is right there. And to your point, you want to attract them to the office and make it someplace that I want to go because it's something that I can't do at home, which is, not video calls and certainly not emails. That's it seems like the answer is not that far. We just have to kind of open our eyes a little bit.
No, it's true. And when you think about it, when you're not coming into the office as much, when you do come in, you're probably willing to spend a little bit more on lunch, or you're more likely to stay after hours to have some social time with your colleagues at, the restaurant up the street. So it's very interesting, the changing dynamic that, although on one hand, hybrid work brings to cities, but on the other hand, the opportunity that it opens.
Right. And I was talking to Brian Elliott from Future Forum, and he made an interesting comment. He said, unfortunately, for the last several years over COVID, there was always kind of this expectation set that we were going to get to some end state, some not, some victory or finish line or something that was just a little bit away. And his point is, no, it's not, and it's not anywhere close, right? This does take work. It is hard. It is evolving. As you said, it's a journey, and there's no like destination 3 months from now, or in Labor Day, or in December, or in February when the holidays are over. It's going to take work, and it's going to it's not easy.
That's true. I will say, though, I believe that there are milestones that we're going to reach. And right now, one of the realities, I should say, that's complicating this whole situation is while we are spending all of our time talking about that structural change towards hybrid work and what it's doing to our office market, there is also around the corner a recession. And that recession is creating a mentality in organizations to be back in a wait and see mode, to potentially be back in an overcorrection mode in terms of the amount of space that they're giving up. And it is creating normal cyclical softening in the office market. I do believe that once we get past a recession and we're back on a strong growth trajectory, that's when we'll really be able to understand and delineate how much of what we're seeing in the office is due to structural trends of hybrid work versus the cyclical trends that always happen in a softening office market due to the economy. I'm not saying that cyclical is overshadowing structural, but I do think that there's both at play, and it's going to take us that milestone of getting past a recession to really be able to understand more from an office perspective how this is going to impact vacancy in the long run.
So do you think that at least in the short term is a more significant factor than, return to office after Labor Day, or and again, we've talked offline that then you still have holidays and stuff even after Labor Day. So you think that it's still kind of the macro situation overshadowing kind of what would be the traditional kind of cycles of summer vacation and holidays and those types of things?
Yes, I mean, but what I would hope happens throughout all of this is that I would bet that in January of 2024, just like we saw in January of 2023, that you see that additional surge. And that's what I would expect, is that office occupancy will continue to tick up. And I would bet by the end of 24, organizations are probably largely going to be at, I would even say probably by mid 2024, going into that summer, they're really going to be at what they would call steady state. Because at that point, if they hadn't pulled all the levers that they need to pull, they're probably never going to. And at that point, then it becomes a rebalancing of the market. Hopefully you have the economy that's growing again at a steady clip, not too soon after that. You have office using employment that's back up on a high trajectory, which means that there's more office space that's needed. Hopefully the tech industry is growing again and doing well. And then you're really going to be able to see where these trends balance out.
Yeah, the other one, I think the other big demographic trend that's kind of hidden within all the other activity is just the growing talent shortage, right? And that's not going to go away, even though we've had a series of layoffs and there's been some challenging times. The demographic trend is large and a big wave, and everything falls from that. But let's shift gears and talk about some positive stuff here in terms of how we can help. And you had some considerations in the back of the report to help companies do better. And one of them was, including employees in the planning process. So, even if you want to have some kind of a mandate, what word am I not supposed to use? A mandate's not the word I'm not supposed to use. Requirement. Thank you. Direction. We'll go with direction. Even if there is a direction from on high, ultimately it's about getting the people involved at the different levels and letting them participate in the definition of what the group norms are going to be forward. And you point that out, that's a really critical piece to this whole puzzle.
It is. I mean, people like to be part of the process. We're a democratic society, right? It just makes sense, and you feel better about something when it's not being dictated to you, but rather you have a say. That doesn't mean that you're going to have the entire say, and that does not mean that you're always going to like the outcome. But as long as you're part of the process, it can help. And I think that it goes both ways. If you're going to be part of the process as an employee, and talk about things like how coming into the office affects your commute, or the type of autonomy that you would like to build into your schedule, or the type of meetings that you would like to be in person versus remote for. You also have to listen to your organization so that when they're speaking about it from their perspective, about the why that the office is so important, that the two sides can come together and meet in the middle. And I think that that is some of the challenge that we're seeing today, is that there is a very small percent of the workforce that doesn't want to come in at all. And if those people really dig in and say, I'm never coming in and it's my right to work from home, then we're verging on a sense of entitlement, not necessarily, and that's going beyond the empowerment that employees and organizations are supposed to feel. And when you're entitled instead of empowered, that's when you start to have challenges and a breakdown of how the system works. True empowerment of employees is them listening to their employer, having their employer listen to them, and then meeting in the middle with a plan that works for the most part for everybody, and that everybody can pull a win-win out of, even though if it's not the perfect state scenario for everybody.
Right. Another thing you talk about is in line with that is supporting the managers in terms of team level agreements. And, Brian had an interesting quote where one of the organizations he worked, they consolidated all the team level agreements and took a look at them and then tried to correlate it to performance, and then, bring some of those best practices and spread them out, beyond those teams that were performing the most. And then, as you say, be creative. I think that's such a good message here. Adrian Rowe, who's a workplace professional, says, you don't have to get it 100% right with the next thing that you do. Be willing to try some things, be willing to experiment, be willing for a few things that necessarily don't work out, and just do them in pencil and not pen, and let's still be in a learning mode. It's a very important kind of attitude about moving forward.
It is. And I mean, I think that lesson of being iterative about your plans is important. And while you're iterative, make sure that you have the process in place, that you're capturing that wealth of data that you're building through having that experiment happen in your organization. And I think that can be difficult because we have to pause. We have to look at what we're doing across the organization, which means that generally you should probably have some kind of a program management office that really is sitting at the eye of the storm and helping to create and aggregate all that data and that wealth of information that you can draw insights from. And we actually are finding that most organizations are not doing that. They don't necessarily have those program management offices that are really looking towards transformational change, which may mean that they're having a missed opportunity right now. So that would definitely be a best practice, is to really, take that wealth of information that you're building from your own experiments and try to build insights from them.
Right. And you even call out specifically in your suggested actions at the back end, almost separating your long-term objectives from your short-term objectives, and keeping your long-term objectives in mind, but really being more hyper-focused and experimental, I would guess, from what you just said, on some of the more shorter-term objectives and how you get there, and being very cognizant that those two are related, but not necessarily the same, certainly not in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So short term is easier to think about. It always has. Real estate planning, we've always had to plan out for 5-year plans, and it has been painfully difficult. And that is only more difficult now. But I think that the longer term out that you get, the more visionary you get. And if you have a vision for what you want the long term to be, then you can make short term decisions with that vision in mind, and always with that threshold of, is this decision in keeping with my long term vision? A really easy way to think about that's much more tangible than how you plan for hybrid work is sustainability. I often talk to organizations that are very focused on sustainability by saying every single decision that you make is going to determine whether you get to your net zero goal by 2030, 2040, 2050, whatever it is. Because if you make a wrong decision right now in haste, without that long-term vision of where you want to get to when it's related to sustainability, then ultimately you're not going to meet your goal, because that decision is going to stay with you for a while. So really creating short-term decisions with the long-term in mind, and where you can't have the long-term in mind, trying to stay as flexible and agile as possible is really important.
Right. And then just on the data side, what are you seeing in terms of evolution on the data side, in terms of getting past the castle badge swipe in, hopefully not tracking keystrokes on the computer and mouse clicks. What are some of the more innovative kind of data things that give you information? I don't want to say utilization is probably better than occupancy. What are some of the more creative or effective data methods that people are using to help support their objectives?
So, I mean, as I said, I think most organizations are still using badge swipe data, which is a challenge because there's only so much that you can do off of that. Sensor data would be the way forward that is going to give you that wealth of information. But there are various reasons, from cost of doing it to the resourcing to be able to do it, to the privacy measures of being able to, of getting over those privacy measures in organizations that are kind of challenging some organizations from fully getting there. But I think that even just doing pilots of that sensor data can make all the difference in the world, because by doing pilots, then you have a test case of the wealth of information that you can draw from it, that then you can bring to your CFO, you can bring to your CEO, you can bring to your chief human resources officer to say, this is how our space is working and how effective it's being based on the utilization of people in it. But we are a long way away from, I think, having that be fully implemented in the stack of tools. I would say most organizations today, from a technology perspective, are still extremely focused on things like video conferencing software and things like even room booking technology. Those are the two areas where organizations are putting their resources and their expenses to really stand up in a good way.
Okay. Well, they would take away my microphone if I didn't ask you about generative AI and the impact of immediately and kind of midterm and long term. What are you seeing? Is anything happening? What gets you excited about kind of the potential of this, kind of cascading leap in AI that was generated last November with what we saw with ChatGPT and the generative AI, but more AI in general and just technology in general, as you see, opportunity to overcome challenges or really kind of change the way that people and buildings and real estate can engage to ultimately be more effective.
So, I mean, I think that there are so many different ways that AI is going to impact the built environment and the way that we use the built environment. If you just look at demand for office space, as AI grows and the companies associated with building this technology and the uses of this technology grow, it could end up being a renaissance for a market like a San Francisco. Time will tell. But there will be companies that are born out of this, and it could be that next push for tech growth, which would be so important, especially in the markets that don't have really a diversified industry and that really need that boost right now. Then it comes down to our buildings and how we use them and how our jobs are. And I know that there's a lot of talk about the jobs that AI takes away. But I think that if we upskill our workforce appropriately and look at the new opportunities that we have to do more strategic and better offerings in our organizations, that ultimately the jobs will maybe not grow at the pace that we're losing them, but they will grow into different places. And I think that what that ends up creating is a world, like I said before, where you have more knowledge workers. And when you have more knowledge workers, you don't have as heavy a dependence on the office, and it's just going to promote this idea of hybrid. And then ultimately, what I also think is going to happen with AI is that it's going to help us with our work processes. So I have said for years now that eventually someday we're going to, look at our Outlook the night before, Monday, and it's going to say, hey, you should really go into the Boston office for me because A, B, and C people that you collaborate with all the time are going to be in also. And there's this project that you're all working on together. I think that AI is going to give us these prompts that we would have never dreamed could be possible, that will help one of the biggest challenges right now, which is ensuring that we come together at the right times and in the right forms of people together that make sense. And I think AI is going to eventually, over time, be able to play a role in that. Not saying it's going to be perfect. I'm sure it'll be messy along the way, but I think it'll play an interesting role in that.
Yeah, I think it's a long way from perfect, but it's funny. Kate Lister said, "Wouldn't it be great if you're working on a PowerPoint and suddenly your laptop vibrated and said, hey, we have other people at the company that are better at PowerPoint than you. Why don't you, why don't you give it to them and you can work on something else? I mean, just to give us some guidance on what's the most productive use of time for that next marginal unit of time, I think will be phenomenal. So exciting time. So I'll give you the last word back on this thing. Anything that jumped out, anything that kind of, maybe we either didn't talk about or that surprised you or delighted you in aggregating this latest set of data from the field?
Nothing really surprised me. I am just delighted that we are in a place where organizations are becoming more decisive. And for anybody listening to this that is not an office proponent, I would say it does not mean that I am fully for the office, but I am happy that organizations are deciding to take one view or the other, because what that allows is for their employees now to be able to shape their lives around what their future is going to be in terms of their profession and how their organization views the future of work. And I think that that's exciting, because I do think for the last 2 years, we have been in a little bit of a middle ground, which has been difficult for anybody to create a routine off of and to create a future off of. And this now is putting us in a space where you know where your organization's intentions are for the most part, and you can either learn to work with them so that your work and your life can be better balanced through hybrid work, or you can choose to go try to find another organization that fits in with your requirements of what you need for flexibility more.
Right, right. Well, as Phil Kirshner would say from McKinsey, be digital first. And you just said, there are lots of investments still going into digital and digital tools. And digital tools and more effective use of digital tools does not mean not going into the office. It means making it more productive when you do go in. So I think there's just a lot of benefits that we should be stopped talking about days of the week and talk about, effectiveness and things you can do at the office that you can't do at home, and focus on the positives instead of the calendar days, which was, meaningful when we were horse travel and everything was measured in days, but we don't measure things in days anymore. We measure things in hours. So great stuff, Julie. Really appreciate the update. And so when's the next update? Should I set my clock for a year from now?
It'll be a year from now, and we usually get a surprise one in between sometime in the fall. So we'll see if we get to do that this year.
All right. Well, thanks again. And thanks for sharing the insight. And again, I just love that you guys go out and get the real data so everyone can stop making assumptions and actually get the data. So really fun to catch up.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
All right. Thank you. All right. She's Julie. I'm Jeff. You're watching Work 20XX. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening on the podcast. We'll see you next time. Take care.
I tried to go into a natural setting with a beautiful Boston background behind me, and I looked like I was in the witness protection program.
It's always something, right?
Yeah.